The year is 1296. A king has just made an example of a city. Not defeated it, not occupied it, made an example of it. Berwick upon Tweed, Scotland's richest trading port, a city of merchants and ships and hard-won prosperity, has been sacked by Edward I of England with a completeness that leaves its neighbors silent with horror. The streets, one chronicler writes, ran red for days. The population was massacred as a message. The message was simple. This is what happens when Scotland resists. Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. A warrior of ferocious will and absolute legal cunning, who had already conquered Wales, who had already expelled the Jews from England, who now looked north at Scotland and saw one thing: unfinished business. And on the volcanic rock rising above the town that would one day be called Edinburgh, that sheer-sided plug of basalt dropping away in near-vertical cliffs on 3 sides, a garrison is making a decision. Surrender, or face what Berwick faced. Stay with me to find out. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. They held out for 3 days. Then they surrendered. This is Edinburgh in the 1300s. Not the Edinburgh of coffee houses and philosophers. Not the Edinburgh of whiskey and festivals and Georgian stone. This is something rawer and older, something that smells of wood smoke and blood and wet rock. This is a town barely large enough to call itself a town, caught at the violent hinge of history, where the question of who owns this land, who rules these people, who decides the fate of this nation, is not being answered in parliaments. It is being answered in sieges, in betrayals, in the dark, on a cliff face, by 30 men who should not have been there at all. Before we go any further into what happened here, we need to understand what Edinburgh was, because it was nothing like what you might picture today. It was a burg, a chartered trading settlement, a single ridge of volcanic rock, roughly a mile long, with the castle at its highest western end and open ground falling away in every direction. Between the castle and the eastern end of the ridge ran a muddy, unpaved track that would eventually become the Royal Mile. Along it, wooden and stone buildings, mostly single-story, cramped, smoky, sat shoulder to shoulder. The population at the start of the century was probably somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people. Not a city by any continental standard, a fortified ridgeline with ambitions. And yet it mattered enormously. The castle on its rock was not just a military position. It was the symbolic heart of Scottish royal power. Whoever held it held a statement about who ruled Scotland. This is why it changed hands again and again through this century. This is why men would risk their lives to take it. And this is why, when one king finally had it back, he ordered it destroyed rather than risk losing it again. But the castle was only part of what Edinburgh was. Down in the burg itself, life was noisy and relentless. The market on the high street was its heartbeat. Fishwives calling their prices, smiths hammering, the smell of tanning hides and open drains competing with the bread from the baker's stalls. Flemish merchants, among the sharpest traders in Northern Europe, had settled here as part of royal policy to build Scotland's trading connections. French wine came in through the ports. Salted herring went out. The town was poor by European standards, but it was alive. The Nor Loch sat to the north of the ridge, a shallow, reedy body of water serving simultaneously as water source, waste dump, and defensive barrier. The smell, in summer, was reportedly spectacular. The church organized everything else. The High Kirk of St. Giles stood at the settlement's center, already ancient by the 1300s. Mass was daily. The liturgical calendar, Advent, Lent, Easter, the feast days of saints, structured the year in a way no secular institution has managed since. The Dominican and Franciscan friars moved through the streets, preaching, teaching, running the town's rough equivalent of a hospital. And above it all, from every angle, every direction, the castle, watching, waiting, to understand what the 1300s meant for Edinburgh, You need to go back to one night in 1286. King Alexander III of Scotland rode his horse off a cliff in the dark. He was returning from Edinburgh Castle, heading home along the Fife coast, when a storm closed in. His companions urged him to stay. He refused. He rode on into the night. They found his body on the beach the following morning. His horse had lost its footing in the dark. Alexander was dead, and Scotland suddenly had no king, no heir, and no plan. Into this vacuum stepped Edward I of England. He offered to arbitrate the succession dispute that followed. He was invited in as a mediator. He arrived as something else entirely. Edward demanded that whoever became King of Scotland acknowledge him as their feudal superior, their overlord. He was, in effect, demanding sovereignty over the country as the price of his arbitration. John Balliol was crowned King of Scots in 1292, having accepted Edward's terms. It was a bargain that could not hold. When Edward demanded Scottish troops to fight in his French wars, Balliol's government refused and signed a mutual defense treaty with France instead. The Old Alliance was born, and Edward's patience ended. He invaded in 1296. Berwick fell first. Edinburgh Castle fell 3 days after its garrison chose surrender over massacre. The Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone of Scottish kings, kept at Scone, was taken to Westminster Abbey. The Scottish royal records were seized. Scottish nobles were made to sign the Ragman Roll, a great list of fealties to the English crown. Scotland was on paper conquered. Edward went home satisfied. He was wrong too. History's answer to Edward I came in the form of a man about whom we know far less than we would like. William Wallace was not a great noble. He was a minor landowner's son from Elderslie in Renfrewshire. He held no castle, commanded no army, had no dynastic claim to anything. He had, as far as we can tell, a talent for violence, a talent for leadership, and a fury that the English occupation of Scotland had sharpened into something purposeful and dangerous. In May 1297, Wallace killed William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark. It may have been revenge for the killing of his wife, or it may have been the opening shot of a planned uprising. The chronicles disagree. What is not disputed is what followed. By September 1297, Wallace had achieved something that stunned all of Europe. At Stirling Bridge, commanding a Scottish force of spearmen, he destroyed an English cavalry army in open battle. The English vanguard crossed the bridge and was caught in a bend of the river, surrounded, annihilated. The English commander, Hugh de Cressingham, hated by Scots and English alike for his cruelty, was killed. According to the chronicles, his skin was flayed and made into sword belts. Medieval warfare did not distinguish between victory and statement. Scotland erupted. Edinburgh breathed free, briefly. Wallace was appointed guardian of Scotland. Edward I came back. At Falkirk in 1298, the English longbow broke the Scottish schiltrons. Wallace's spearmen, who had held at Stirling, could not hold against massed archery on open ground. The Scottish cavalry, commanded by nobles whose loyalty to the cause was, at best, conditional, fled the field without engaging. Wallace survived. His authority did not. He resigned the guardianship. He fought on in other ways for years. He was finally captured in 1305, betrayed by a Scottish knight who handed him to the English. What Edward did to Wallace in London in August 1305 was designed to erase him. He was hanged until nearly dead. He was disemboweled and his entrails burned before his eyes. He was beheaded. His body was cut into 4 parts and sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling as a warning. His head was set on London Bridge. Edward believed this was the end of the matter. He had not reckoned on Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce is one of the most morally complicated figures of the medieval world. He had sworn fealty to Edward I. He had fought, at different points, on both sides of the conflict. He was not a straightforward patriot. He was a calculating, highly intelligent nobleman who understood power, how it worked, how it could be seized, and what it would cost. In February 1306, Bruce met his great rival John Comyn at the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. A holy place, a sanctuary. They argued. Bruce drew his knife and stabbed Comyn at the altar. It was sacrilege. It was murder. It was also the moment that made everything else inevitable. Bruce could no longer navigate the middle ground. He had committed an act for which there was no forgiveness from Edward and no retreat from the path he had chosen. Within weeks, he was crowned King of Scots at Scone. What followed was catastrophe. The English crushed his forces. His brothers were captured and executed. His wife and daughters were imprisoned. Bruce himself became a fugitive, hiding in the Western Isles and Ireland through the winter of 1306 to 1307, pursued, hunted, reduced to nothing. He chose to return. From 1307 onwards, Bruce waged a campaign of extraordinary patience and tactical brilliance. He avoided open battle with the English when their forces were superior. He raided English supply lines. He accepted guerrilla warfare when pitched battle would have destroyed him. And Edward I, still marching north to crush Bruce, still convinced he could finish this, died on the road in 1307. His son Edward II was a different kind of man entirely. Less capable, less ruthless, less dangerous. Bruce began to reclaim Scotland, castle by castle, town by town. By 1313, Edinburgh Castle was one of the last English strongholds in Scotland. And then came the night that decided its fate. March 1314. A Scottish knight named Thomas Randolph, Bruce's nephew, one of his most trusted commanders, needed to take the castle. The rock face was sheer. The English garrison was alert. A direct assault was impossible. A man named William Francis came forward. He had grown up near the castle's walls and knew a secret. A narrow path up the north face of the rock, near vertical, used by young men who wanted to slip out at night without using the gate. He had climbed it himself, as a young man, to visit a woman in the town below. Randolph chose to trust him. 30 men. Darkness. Silence. Single file up a cliff face that would kill any of them who lost their footing. At one point, a guard above them dislodged a stone. It clattered past them in the dark. The guard called down into the blackness. As a bluff, certain no one could possibly be climbing that face. The 30 men pressed themselves against the rock and did not breathe. The guard moved on. They reached the top. They overwhelmed the garrison. They opened the gates. Randolph's main force poured in. And then, following Bruce's standing orders, they destroyed it. Every wall, every tower, every fortification, torn down so that no English force could ever use Edinburgh Castle as a stronghold again. A king who destroyed his own castle rather than risk losing it a second time. That is the measure of how this war was being fought. 3 months later, at Bannockburn, Bruce shattered the English army in open battle. Edward II fled the field on horseback, barely escaping with his life. Scotland's independence, won in the mud and blood of a June afternoon in 1314, was not yet formal. That would come with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. But after Bannockburn, everyone understood the truth. Scotland was not conquered. It had never truly been conquered. And it would not be. Wars are what historians record. But the people of Edinburgh, the fishwife and the cobbler, the ale brewer and the friar, were not in the chronicles. They were buying bread, mending boots, burying their children. And the 14th century made all of that harder than it had ever been. In 1315 and 1316, the year after Bannockburn, when Scotland should have been exhaling with relief, the Great Famine began. Catastrophic harvests across all of Northern Europe, driven by a dramatic cooling of the climate that historians now call the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Crops failed, year after year. Animals died. The roads filled with people walking desperately toward any town that might have food. Edinburgh, as a market burg, became a destination for the starving. And Edinburgh did not have enough. Contemporary chroniclers describe people eating horses, eating dogs. The church distributed what it could. The wealthy hoarded. The famine lasted until roughly 1322. By the time it ended, between 10 and 20% of Northern Europe's population was dead. And then, in 1349, when the century had already broken people in almost every way possible, the Black Death arrived. It had crossed Asia. It had devoured the Middle East. It had torn through France and England. And in the summer and autumn of 1349, it crossed the border into Scotland. Scottish soldiers, massing to raid northern England while the English reeled from the plague, were reportedly joking about the foul death of the English. Then the plague reached the Scottish camp. The joking stopped. No one in the 14th century understood what the plague was. They did not know about bacteria or fleas or rats. The best medical thinking attributed it to bad air or to a malign conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sky. God's wrath was universally invoked. None of it helped. Edinburgh lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its population in the first outbreak alone. Further waves struck in 1361, 1379, and the 1390s. The churchyards were overwhelmed. There were not enough priests to administer last rites to everyone dying. And for a deeply Catholic population, dying without the sacraments was a terror almost equal to death itself. But here is the thing about catastrophe at this scale. It breaks things. And sometimes, the things it breaks needed breaking. When a third of the population dies, the price of labor rises. Workers become scarce. Landowners who had never once negotiated with the people who worked their fields suddenly found themselves negotiating. The feudal certainties that had held for centuries began, slowly, to crack. Edinburgh's women held the town together through all of it. They brewed the ale, and in the medieval world, brewing was a female occupation, the alewife or brewster a fixture of every burgh, running what was effectively a pub from her home. They worked as healers, delivering babies, setting bones, managing fevers with herbal knowledge passed down through families across generations. When their husbands died, and in a century of war and plague and famine, husbands died constantly. Widows took over the running of businesses entirely, acquiring a legal independence that married women were denied. They are not in the chronicles, but they are the reason the burgh survived. In 1320, 6 years after Bannockburn, and while the formal peace with England was still not signed, the Scottish nobility wrote a letter to the Pope. They needed the papacy to recognize Bruce as Scotland's legitimate king. They needed the Pope to lift the excommunication that Bruce's killing of Comyn in a church had earned him. And so they wrote, in Latin, on parchment, with the seals of the great lords hanging below it like the teeth of a comb. The document is called the Declaration of Arbroath. And buried inside the political arguments and the Latin formalities is a passage that does not sound like a letter to a pope. It sounds like something else entirely. It says that even if Robert Bruce himself were to submit to English rule, the Scots would choose another king to defend their freedom, because they are fighting not for glory, not for riches, not for honor. They are fighting for freedom alone. And freedom is the thing that no honest man surrenders, but with his life. Those words were written by noblemen, in a monastery, as a piece of diplomatic correspondence. But they captured something that was true in Edinburgh too, in the market and the close and the cold stairwells of the burgh's timber tenements, in the decisions of merchants who kept trading through the occupation, in the courage of 30 men choosing to climb a moonlit cliff face because someone had to. By the end of the 1300s, Edinburgh was consolidating. The castle, destroyed on Bruce's orders in 1314, was rebuilt. David II, Bruce's son, who became king at age 5, began David's Tower in the 1360s, a great statement in stone of renewed royal investment in the town. The administrative machinery of the Scottish crown was gravitating toward Edinburgh. It was not yet formally the capital, but it was becoming one. The 14th century broke Scotland repeatedly. It began with invasion. It passed through famine. It survived the winning of independence only to be devastated by the plague. It watched its kings captured, exiled, killed. It endured English raids on towns and farms that had only just begun to recover. And yet, the town on the ridge did not stop. The market opened. The ale was brewed. The friars moved through the streets. The children who survived the plague grew up and had children of their own. The castle was rebuilt. The words of Arbroath were copied and sent across Europe. Before we end, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There is a reason Scotland is still Scotland. There is a reason the language, the law, the identity survived what this century threw at it. It is because of a minor landowner's son with a fury that couldn't be extinguished. A king who committed sacrilege and chose to become a legend instead of a criminal. 30 soldiers on a cliff face in the dark, trusting a path that one of them had used as a young man to visit a woman he loved. And a town of 2,000 to 4,000 people that refused, against every reasonable expectation, to stop being itself. The rock is still there. The city is still there. And the story, as it turns out, was only just beginning. What part of the history of Edinburgh in 1200 to 1300 interests you the most?